Welcome to Talent Strategy 60. I am your friendly neighborhood talent strategy nerd, Dr. Jim, and when that dramatic music hits, we're in for another great episode on the show with some fabulous panelists, and we're going to be tackling some element of the employee life cycle and important topics that impact organization and organizational effectiveness. So today's conversation, obviously the mission of Talent Strategy 60 is to empower talent leaders to do more with less. And today we're going to tackle the topic of building psychological safety within organizations and building a psychologically safe culture. In the course of the conversation, we're going to answer three different questions, and that's going to come from our panelists. The answers are going to come from our panelists. We're going to learn how or what the role of vulnerability is in building safe cultures. We're going to learn how intentionality can be leveraged to build safe organizations. And we're going to learn what role modeling and measurement play in building a psychologically safe environment. So those are some pretty big signposts and pretty big missions that we have for this conversation. And obviously, we're going to leverage community intelligence in helping solve those problems. And that's why we have a panel discussion today. So first up, I want to introduce our panelists to the audience. And audience, feel free to drop questions, comments, use the emojis so you can let us know how the topic is resonating with you as we get into the discussion. First up, I want to introduce Rhonda to the show. Rhonda, welcome aboard. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the work that you're involved with.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Rhonda Y. Williams. I'm CEO of Above the Grind Leadership. And my background is I'm a registered nurse by background and spent many years as a healthcare executive, as a chief nursing officer, hospital CEO, and then also spent probably 10 plus years working with organizations globally to transform, create, and enhance culture. So I am all about all things leadership, and that includes what it takes to create psychologically safe workplaces. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Thanks for joining us and giving us a little bit of your background. Now, one of the things that I'm curious about in terms of your is how you got into this space coming out of clinical healthcare, especially given how intense that environment is. How did you marry those two topics? Because it just doesn't seem like, within the healthcare space, there's a lot of room for building psychologically safe environments, as noted by the level of turnover that nurses and clinicians in hospital systems have.
Yeah, so great question. As a leader in healthcare, one of my responsibilities was to build and create teams. So anytime I think you're in that space of building and creating teams, that speaks to culture, right? So we worked many years on improving our quality outcomes, which the only way we could do that was to build culture within the team. That had to do with psychological safety, et cetera. So it's that aspect, but I think you'd be surprised. So healthcare operate in just culture, and there are a lot of initiatives today to help healthcare organizations create more psychologically safe cultures. I think the pandemic probably set us back 20 years. But aside from that, moving forward, organizations really are trying to embed and embrace the idea of psychologically safe cultures. And with professional nurses and obviously physicians driving the boat, I think they are key to making sure that happens throughout the hospital systems.
Awesome context, and I appreciate you sharing that. Looking forward to your insights into this conversation. Next up, I want to introduce Jamie to the show. Jamie, welcome aboard, and tell the audience a little bit about your background and experience and the work that you're involved with.
Yes, Dr. Jim, thank you for having me here. So excited to be speaking with both you, Rhonda and Sonia. A little bit about me. My name is Jamie Adasi. I'm originally from the Washington, D.C., Maryland metro area, and I'm coming to you all today with about 14 years of experience leading DEIB initiatives and programs across higher education, behavioral health care, SaaS, where I am now, and nonprofit communities. And I also have a background in counseling and personnel services, spiritual psychology, and have worked within the behavioral healthcare systems within Colorado and Maryland. And at Greenhouse Software, where I am now, I get to serve as our head of inclusion, diversity, equity, and allyship, or what we call IDEA. And really in that role, what I get to do is bring our employees together across our varying backgrounds and global differences to help us meet and achieve our very ambitious goals. And we'll talk a little more about Greenhouse later on, but we are the hiring operating system for people first companies and have won a ton of awards when it comes to our company culture. And so workplace culture has always been really important to me. And I believe you can't have a really strong workplace culture without having psychological safety at the core of it. So really excited to be here today and to get into this conversation with you all.
Awesome stuff, Jamie. And for those of you who are following any of us on LinkedIn, if I'm sure that you can see Greenhouse folks popping up all over the feeds on podcasts and various things, just like Jamie is today. I do have a question for you, Jamie, and it might be a little bit out of left field. Now, you have a background in psychology and counseling. And when we're talking about the topic of building psychological safety within organizations, you might get the argument that, hey, I don't have this deep background in this area to be equipped to do this. What advice would you have for novices? I can't think of a better word right now to help move the needle when it comes to psychological safety when they don't have the training or background that you have.
100%. The first thing I will say is being in corporate environments, I've definitely noticed quickly that many people don't have my same background. And so a lot of the things that I do is encourage folks to get educated and also just to assess, where are your leadership teams? Where is your staff? So when it comes to just understanding what psychological safety is, literally having a definition and making sure that your teams feel like, hey, can I talk about mental health and well-being? Is that even a thing that's okay for us here at X company? And making sure that you're in an environment where that's really encouraged. Luckily for me at Greenhouse Software, even though everyone doesn't have a background in psychology, this well-being, mental health, mindfulness, all the things that we're talking about today are super critical to our business success, in particular because we are a people-first company. And so I would say, if you are someone who's starting in as a novice, educate yourself, go to psychology today, work with external consultants. We get to work with Heal House here at Greenhouse. They are a Black-owned, Brooklyn-based health and well-being company who comes in to talk to our staff. So there's a lot of strategies that we can get into in a bit, but I would say be really open to the journey of not needing to know everything, but being open to learning.
So there's and I want to get to Sonia in just a second, but I want to call out something that you just said, Jamie, and that's the idea of asking or at least having a sense of what is acceptable within an environment as a starting point. One of the conversations that I had in an earlier show, we had Phil Yurkovich and Damar from Hyliion. So Phil is from Phenom, and the conversation was around normalizing mental health conversations in the workplace, because that's one of the big initiatives in terms of how you actually make a more employee centric organization going forward. And I think that conversation that happened several weeks ago ties really well into some of the things that you're talking about. So I appreciate you calling that out. Last but certainly not least, I want to welcome Sonia to the show. Sonia, long time no see.
Yes, Dr. Jim, thank you so much for having me on. I really I'm honored to be on this panel with these wonderful ladies, both Rhonda and Jamie. And there's a lot to talk about, right? But in terms of my background, I started as a NASA engineer because I wanted to be an astronaut. And and then I went into Fortune 500 companies, working in aerospace and defense. So talk about diversity and inclusion. In most of the roles, I was the only woman in the room. And but it was in my last corporate job that I was given a second hat to lead diversity, equity, and inclusion. And back then I had no really structure or information about how to do that. Frankly, I didn't know where to start. Like many people don't know how to do that. So today I am coming to you from Los Angeles, where the headquarters of our company is. Our office, we are a leader in workplace culture and DEI space. We have both a technology, SaaS platform, and expertise in creating just what we're going to talk about: psychologically safe and transparent workplace cultures for really for everyone to feel like they belong and can be productive. We have been working with iconic brands, public companies, government, nonprofit, as well as small and medium-sized companies and even startups. I think people can see us on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, certainly, as with this event, we post a lot, and I can be reached at any time. We can, I think, put the information later on if anybody wants to find out more. We're delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on, and I'm looking forward to all of your perspectives. But I'm not going to let you off the hook this easily. So, in your intro, you just kind of threw out there that I was an engineer at NASA, and I do. And shocker, I have a follow up with that comment, and it ties directly into the conversation that we're talking about. So when we think about, and I'm going to make some assumptions here, so don't yell at me if I get this wrong, but you're an engineer in NASA, which generally tends to be more of a male dominated space. So the question that I have for you when you're navigating that experience, as well as the rest of your career, which tended to be in those sort of spaces, how did you build the capability to navigate that environment in a safe way? Because I think that's an important thing for anybody that catches this to know, like, what was your process for navigating that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because when I was when I said I wanted to be an astronaut, no woman had yet been into space. It was many years later when finally we had the first woman in space, and since then, whether it was in the C-suite, the boardroom, I've always had that. I was talking to someone else yesterday, a gentleman who was sharing the same thing, that I was very fortunate. NASA was naturally an inclusive environment, in fact. And I had some really great allies. So I would say that I wasn't so intentional, as we will talk about, that it's good to be intentional about, how do I navigate that? But I had great allies. And I always had a sense that at the end of the day, everything depends on people, working with people. So I reached out when I had a question, at least I was, going out there, as Jamie said, it's all about educating yourself, but also educating others, So as a person, with my lived experience, I didn't expect everyone to kind of know where I'm at. Today is very different. We expect organizations to actually do a lot more on their end. But as a young engineer navigating that space, I always reached out to people. As a result, I have many long life friends now that are mentors, and we've known each other for longer than I care to share on this on this public event. But they were, and most of them were people, men much older than me, white men, and they were great allies at that time. So I think that went a long way towards really helping me know when to ask, to find my voice, and I credit that always.
Awesome stuff. And thanks for sharing. And for those of you who are watching on the stream, make sure you're dropping your questions or comments in the chat. I have warned the panel that they're likely to get some wild cards and some variables thrown in as part of the conversation. So definitely make sure that you're dropping that in. So let's set the stage here. We're having this conversation on psychological safety, and we're being intentional about having this conversation because my position as an observer of things is that a lot of organizations will move forward with any number of initiatives, DEI or otherwise, but let's keep it in the realm of DEI for this conversation. They'll hear something needs to be done, they'll launch an initiative, and they'll move forward with that initiative. And 9 times out of 10, it's not an official statistic, but it's going to be what I use. 9 times out of 10, that is setting yourself up for failure because you don't have the necessary foundation for those initiatives to be successful. So that's the position that I take on why this conversation on psychological safety is critical as a first and foundational conversation versus moving off into the specifics of initiatives. So my question to you, Jamie, is, am I off base? What's been your experience when the necessary foundation hasn't been laid? How have you seen that play out?
That's a great question, Dr. Jim. The first thing I would say is, yes, I have been in different places where, it's a lot of, we're talking about well-being being important. We're talking about DEIB being important, but then there's not the actual infrastructure in place to make sure that things can actually be successful. And that means some basic stuff. So if you're talking about psychological safety in the first place, how are you connecting that to your values, to your mission, to how your organization is running? Do you have a team in place, for example, who's going to be taking on some of these initiatives, not just one person on a people team in the corner somewhere saying, hey, this is really important? Do you have this work tied to the OKRs, your KPIs, the goals that you're setting for yourselves? At Greenhouse, we do actually have org-wide goals around our health as an organization, in particular, making sure our employees are really healthy in the work that we're doing to be able to meet our financial goals. And so if you don't have that link set up anywhere, it will definitely just be an initiative that comes out of nowhere, run by one person that, you know, we hope is spearheaded long enough to have some impact, and then usually just dies off, unfortunately. But again, when you can actually bake it into the way in which you work and make sure that a team is really holding this up in some way, and your executives are as well, then you can see some success and progress over time.
So I love how you called out, Jamie, the DEI or any initiative needs to be tied to business results. And I think that's a critical point to call out this early in the show, because, and I want Sonia's take on it, because if you don't do it that way, I mean, all of this stuff drives critical business outcomes, but if you're not tying it to those outcomes, you're just making activity for the sake of activity. So Sonia, I know that one of the things that you allow, or you empower organizations through our office, is to actually measure this stuff. So why is it critical to start from a business outcome and foundational perspective when it comes to the measurements aspect of any initiative that you want to launch? Tell us a little bit about how the role that data and analytics plays in making these initiatives feel authentic versus performative.
Yes, it's both making it feel authentic and making it be productive, frankly, at the end. You know, we talk to so many people that have initiatives going on. They've had initiatives going on for years. They have a plan, but at the end of the day, you know, it's very dependent on perhaps one leader, you know, just being there when the leader. That's what happened to me, you know, in my own experience when I was given a second hat to lead DEI at a Fortune 500. You know, the intention was there. The leaders were all behind it. We had budget. We did a lot of activities, but we failed to make that initial connection that Jamie just talked about. And so over time, first of all, as priorities came and went, you know, it got just, you know, a little bit, it, you know, fell by the wayside. So there was this, you know, ebb and flow of the activity, and the consistency is really important, right, for these kind of things to take. But also, you know, after I left, you know, to my chagrin, within a few months, my team, my colleagues, even my boss, everybody was contacting me and saying, you know, everything is unraveling. And again, it's because, so it's the sustainability of the effort. It's the results and the sustainability. It's got to be connected. At our office, we start with that. As you know, we have a process called the ACT process. We have a bias for action, so we found an acronym that actually works well. And the first step is the A is for align. The C and the T are for connect and transform. But the A is really important and is the very first step. We take time to make sure that we understand what the business objectives are, what the strategic priorities are, and then connect that with DE&I to write, you know, to do a plan for the D&I that connects and is very visibly, you know, communicated with everyone as well.
Great stuff, Sonia. And I want to hand it off to Rhonda really quick in a similar vein. You know, Sonia, you referenced this in your answer. If you're not tying the data, or you're not tying the business outcomes to it, what you end up having is, you know, a single person handles the initiative, and that has some negative impacts once that person leaves or changes roles. I'm curious to get Rhonda's take on her experience, especially in clinical, from the clinical space, where that necessary foundation hasn't been laid. What are some of the things that you've seen in terms of impact at the people level, not necessarily the person that's driving the initiative, but how is it received by the rank and file when that alignment from business objectives and initiative isn't built out?
Yeah, so great question. And I love the responses that Sonia and Jamie gave to build this for us. And that is, movement for the sake of movement is not helpful. right? So an octopus moves all over the place. Is it going front, back, side? Where's it going, right? And half the time you look and you don't even know. So for us, one of the things that we do in Above the Grind is we have a model that we call the try why. And this model is really important, and it speaks to what Sonia just mentioned about really understanding the alignment. So the first why in the try why is the organization's why. Why does this matter? Why is it important? Why are we doing it? What difference does it make? What happens if we don't do it? Right? So understanding all of that matters, and then you can really generate a bit of momentum and interest around this. People have to see where we're going and why we're going there. The second why in the try why is the leader's why. And I would be really interested in hearing Jamie and Sonia's take on this, because I feel like this is somewhere where a bit of disconnect happens. So the organization says, this is our why. This is our big mission. Everybody goes rah, rah. That's great. And then the leader's going, well, for me, all it means is more work. And I don't really get it. I don't think it's important, right? So automatically you've lost a bit of that alignment that's critical for moving this forward. And then the third level in why is your users, your people, your employees, your greatest assets. Why does it matter to them? If you can get the try why aligned between all of these critical stakeholders, you can generate momentum and you can generate movement. If either one of these falls off, then you're likely to have a stall in your progress.
Can you just drop the mic and walk off at this point? And I'm low key disappointed that the folks that are watching the stream didn't just blow up the emojis. So hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You folks need to like throw some thumbs up and claps on that. That was great, Rhonda. And I know that everybody's got a response on it, so or comment on it. So Jamie, Rhonda dropped the mic. Pick it up. Your turn.
Oh my goodness. Well, to tap into the piece around why is that important, or why is psychology important to leaders in particular? If you look at what we're going through in the world today, from war to weather, crazy things happening with weather. I'm thinking about Turkey and Syria, what just happened there with the earthquakes, to racial injustice, gun violence. We're dealing with a lot. And on top of that, some of us are actually in these remote and hybrid environments. And so when I think about why this is important for leaders, employees are expecting a different level of awareness and interaction from leaders in today's modern work environment. That means that we are literally zooming into people's homes. I'm in each of our homes right now with you all. That means that we have to become really more open to having more personal conversations, checking in on how our employees are doing. And especially when you have folks who are from underrepresented backgrounds, making sure that they're especially attended to and taken care of when there's a lot blowing up in the world. So when I think about the why, for me, I get a lot of questions from managers and directors, et cetera. What do I do? The X person on my team is going through something. I have no idea how to respond. And so I think the why is you want to make sure that folks are being inclusive leaders. And that means showing up visibly committed to this work and also being vulnerable in that, which I know we'll talk a little bit about in a moment. But that's kind of a little bit of the why. It's just to be able to deal with the current dynamics of our workplace environments.
So it's a great segue, Jamie, that you put in there, as far as here are all the external environments or external situations that everybody's dealing with, and you tie in, the why, like Rhonda did. I'm half hoping somebody tags Simon Sinek with in this conversation with all of the why discussion that we're having, because it's a fundamental discussion. So that actually you introduced this, Jamie, and I want to have Sonia offer her perspective on it. You mentioned all of these external situations that are happening that everybody within an organization is impacted by. And the question becomes, how do you communicate that as a leader to help set the foundation for success on any initiative? And this points really at the issue of leadership vulnerability. And I'd like Sonia's perspective on it, in terms of how do you create the space to be vulnerable as a leader, because that's necessary to kind of advance anything else after the fact. What are the things that you would suggest that leaders need to do when they're seeing all of these external things that are impacting their teams, and they want to surface that to create a more effective internally, so that you can advance some of these business objectives? What's your take on it? Sonia, you're on mute.
Thank you. We know that for every transformation, it has to be made personal. We have to feel it, right? Most big decisions we make, there's a large component of feeling about it. That's just as humans, we're all like that to varying degrees. And so for a leader, I think what's really important, and I'll give you a very brief anecdote about this in a moment, but it's really important to first make it personal for themselves. And that comes to the vulnerability, sharing what they're dealing, their own unconscious biases, their own learning that they need to do, their own lived experience that they have or they lack. And then also at the same time, it is to also make it personal for each team member. Why should they care, right? I mean, Rhonda made a great point about, the why and this, the golden circle and Simon Sinek. I'm glad you said that, Dr. Jim. It's really important. And we had a LinkedIn user that actually made the point also about, everybody has to be involved in this, right? Every department. So again, it's actually the second letter, C in our ACT process at our office is for connect. And so this connecting is about, great, you establish the why, you have a plan, it lays all this out. But then, how does everybody know about it? Why should they care, right? So making it visible, and one of the big things that we're all about is communication is everything, right? If you have a great plan and a small group are working on it, it's not going to get you very far. You have to make sure that in some way, it's and these days, a digital platform and these kind of environments are available, so everybody can at all times know what's going on. And that's another way that the leader can also show his or her own vulnerability is, communicate. Sometimes, it's through in person. Sometimes people say, well, my whole team is hybrid. It's all, a lot of people are remote. How do I connect with everyone? And that's where I think there's a lot of technology. All of us are using it now, as Jamie was pointing out. We use it in our daily lives. How many hours and times we use using social media. So for workplace, I think that in the past, one of the things that was the issue was people didn't want their employees like on some digital platform. They didn't want them, distracted. But now I think people are recognizing, and certainly as we work with people, we see this, that they see that as a necessity. You got to connect people. And in that connection, there's a direct way for a leader to, 24/7 be both hearing from employees and also sharing, their own vulnerabilities. So I think people are vulnerable. We all have moments of vulnerability, but how do you communicate it? How do we show it? And that's where I think we also talk, of course, about, how do you progress in that with different tools and solutions that might be available.
I really like your insight on this, Sonia. But I'm going to play devil's advocate, and Rhonda, you're going to be my victim on it. I take all of the stuff that Sonia said, and it's valid. But I know that there's leaders that are out there that are sitting there thinking potentially, this stuff is all soft and squishy, and it really doesn't have any impact on anything. And I really don't want to get in my people's business with all of this vulnerability stuff. Paraphrasing, I may or may not have said that before, but just saying. So I'd be curious to get your take, Rhonda, having led large hospital systems in high stress environments where leaders are stretched beyond belief, and you're bringing up, the need to be vulnerable as a leader. How do you bridge that gap when a leader says, this stuff isn't for me, and I have too much other stuff that I'm doing, so I'm going to pass? What would be your response on how you turn that around?
So I think we need another show to talk about this, because the first place I'm going to start is it requires a paradigm shift in what leadership is, right? Leadership, if you were thinking that leadership is simply tactical, task-focused, or results-driven, that's not the leadership of today. That might have worked 50 years ago. One could argue that it didn't even work very well then. However, today's leaders need what we call those soft skills, which is a term that I absolutely hate, by the way, because they're not soft skills. They are essential skills. right? If you don't have them, if you don't know how to connect with people, if you can't be vulnerable, if you can't do those things, then you are likely to be the leader who's experiencing quiet quitting, the great resignation, and all of these other workplace trends happening. That is that leader who thinks that they're okay because they are tactically strong. I think the other piece of it is helping people understand what vulnerability actually is. Right. And so one of the mistakes I think that we make is assuming that because I say be vulnerable, we assume that all leaders know what that is and what it means and what it looks like. They don't. Right. This is relatively new for us. So I think we've got to lead on this by modeling it a bit. So let's talk just briefly vulnerability versus being open, right? I can have an open conversation about anything. Most leaders can be open. Most leaders struggle with being vulnerable, which is a little bit more heartfelt. It's a little bit deeper, a little bit below the surface. And here's a key element, it needs to be a little bit more uncomfortable. Right. So if I'm being vulnerable as a leader in healthcare, when we started going to Just Culture, we said, tell us you made a mistake. Tell us that medication error, that you did make that error, because that's the only way that we can fix it. Right. Well, that's uncomfortable. That means that me as the leader, I had to step into that space and lean into that space and say, you know what, I don't have all the answers here. In a place where we have taught leaders that you get paid the big bucks, you should show up with the answers. That's your job. So we've created this sort of this persona of a leader that is very difficult now for leaders to overcome, because now we're saying, oh, be vulnerable. You don't have to know it all, right? So we're operating about against what we've told people for the last 50 years. So I think the first thing that we have to do is we have to help leaders. We have to teach it. We have to show it. We have to role model it. Because if we show role model and teach our leaders, they can then help their teams with it, right? As a leader, I can't help my team do something that I have no idea how to do. Right. So I think that that's a really important aspect. What is vulnerability? What is being open? And what does leadership mean today? Right. What's the definition of how you view what a leader is in today's modern workplace?
I really like the reframe of what you did there, Rhonda, in terms of redefining what the responsibilities and objectives of leadership are. It's no longer the command and control. And actually, if I'm taking all of the great stuff that you just said and then turning it into my comic book mind and turning it into a bumper sticker, you're better off as a leader being like Jon Snow and not knowing anything. I know nothing. And relying on your people to solve that way. So that's we're going to go with that.
One of my favorite sayings for my kids around the house is, you know less than Jon Snow, and in this case, that's probably a good thing.
Nice, Jamie. I want to get your take on it in terms of some of the impacts associated with that old way of thinking in terms of vulnerability. So share with us a little bit of what you've seen.
For sure. You know, I'm actually going to call in a Deloitte study that was done around inclusive leadership behaviors. One of the things that they found from employees who are rating their leaders as being really important right now are things like transparency, things that we maybe weren't comfortable doing before, folks being more authentic and vulnerable, things that we've been talking about, and also creating that space, like we said earlier, to be able to share when people are having issues that they're going through. And when we think about, kind of the command and control version of workplaces often coming from war times, so really helping us in many ways, those now can be looked at in some ways as toxic cultures, right? And so when we think about the cost of attrition to many companies, can be up in the millions, depending on how big your company is. When a leader asks me, why is this important right now? I don't have time for this. Well, do you have time to keep hiring for your team every other month or every other quarter because you can't keep people right now? One thing that someone said on my team, Kevin Doe, he's a senior manager on our customer success team at a recent all hands. He said, you can fake it like you care, but you can't fake it like you're there, right? With today's candidates, with today's employees, they read through a lot of the stuff that maybe we thought we could, hide before. And so doesn't mean you get to share all of your information, be, overextending your personal stuff, or tell them, just tell me everything personal about you. We're not saying that. We're just saying you're creating that space so that if something is happening in someone's world, they can feel a little bit more comfortable coming towards you so that you know how to work with them to provide the accommodations needed to get the job done in the best way possible.
I'm going to echo what Rusty Atkinson in the chat has said, is that this has been like a revolving door of mic drops from the three panelists. So really, really great stuff. There are a couple things that I want to just highlight in this part of the conversation. Command and control doesn't work. If you really want to solve some of the biggest problems facing organizations today, and that ties into employee retention and turnover, and you want to get off of the talent attraction hamster wheel, you have to focus on leading in a way that responds to how the world of work functions best these days. Command and control doesn't work. So you need to be looking at how can you empower your workforce to actually get more done by giving them the freedom to act. And that starts with being vulnerable. So great stuff. And I appreciate everybody's input so far. And again, for those that are watching on the stream across all of the different channels, make sure you drop your questions or comments in there, or at least hit the emojis so that, and I sound like I'm a Twitch streamer or something. Hit those emojis. So let's switch gears a little bit. And we've talked about vulnerability. And it's not, it might be a muscle that is underdeveloped in a lot of organizations or in a lot of, when you're looking at building safe environments, how can you be intentional in executing that? And I want to have Jamie lead that and have Sonia come in afterwards. So Jamie, share with us on how you've seen intentionality operationalize at an organization to help move these things forward.
100%. First thing I would say is developing some type of survey focus group methodology, whether that's qualitative or quantitative information you're taking in, just to get a baseline for where your organization is. So at Greenhouse, we run an inclusion survey, and in that we actually ask questions around psychological safety to understand how we're doing. We've been lucky to score a 91% positive sentiment around our inclusion efforts across the company. That doesn't happen with just my IDEA team in the corner. It's all of us taking on IDEA as central to our roles, including all of our leaders. And so I would say leading by example is going to be super important. I'll also go back to what Rhonda said earlier, looking at that individual kind of team, even regional and org-wide perspectives. You know, at Greenhouse, we're a global company. We operate between Ireland to Canada to the US. And so psychological safety looks different depending on even the employees we're talking about. Or drilling in a little bit more, you know, we've talked to folks who are South and Southeast Asian women or Hispanic, Latinx men, Black women to understand, like, what are your experiences within psychological safety and how can we do better? So I would say providing those spaces, being a visible person around IDEA and well-being and all the work that we're talking about. And then I mentioned this earlier, but this idea around vulnerability hangover, y'all may have heard of this. So as a leader, being really aware of, if I'm modeling what this looks like, making sure that I'm, of course, being comfortable with what I'm sharing, and also providing the space that maybe folks won't always feel comfortable coming forward. You may have an introvert on your team who doesn't want to always speak up. So using your spidey senses, as I call them, to look and see, has something shifted for X person on my team or on the committee I'm working with? How can we then, you know, problem solve together and work to bring out other ways that we can be supporting these people? And so those are a couple of things I would say just to get things going.
Great insights, Sonia. I'd like your input on the data and analytics side when we're talking about intentionality, but also taking it from the data side and putting it into action, because it's fine to have the information in front of you. Now, how do you put that into motion for impact? If you can share some of your experience or thoughts on it, that would be great.
Yeah, 100%. And I love that connection between, you know, action, analytics, and engagement. You need all these three things, right? And so let me explain. I mean, in terms of the data, first of all, the why, you know, I still am reflecting on what Rhonda said about, you know, the why. That really was a great start. And you know, the why today, you asked about how do we make sure that this is important for leaders? Well, there's recent Gallup data just late last year that today at least 50% of U.S. workforce are quiet quitters, what we call quiet quitters, right? And what's more historic is because this quiet quitting is a new thing, and we're just measuring it, so it's still pretty significant number. But the ratio of the engaged to actively disengaged is now the highest it's been. It's at 1.8 to 1. So for every one person who's engaged, you have almost two that are disengaged. So that's been a problem for a long time. I think the pandemic and everything we've talked about has brought it more into light. Now, how do we deal with that? You talked about vulnerability. We talked about, bottom line, we're going to talk about creating psychological safety. And I love the idea of surveys, of course. All companies need to do. Greenhouse does a great job. A lot of companies do a good job of that. But I always say, while they're good, they have their limits, because you only know what people are thinking at the very moment that you ask them the very question you ask them, right? You don't know what they're thinking all the other rest of the time. And I'll tell you our data on that, in terms of really finding out, why are people quiet quitting? Why aren't they really, engaged? I mean, nobody comes to work saying, I plan to be disengaged today, or I prefer to be disengaged, right? And it comes to, the organization is not providing what they need, the psychological safety to do their best. And to find that out, you really need an environment where there is transparency and where there is, frankly, anonymity. And we provide that on our platform. The engagement part of our solution, has this ability for people to be anonymous. I mean, a lot of people say, we have Slack, we have, Teams, but you can't be anonymous. And it's not intentional, back to the intentionality. So the data on that is that if you have, let's say, 10% people of color, or you have, 25% women, for example, when it comes to a safe environment like that, we see twice, across the board, all kinds of different companies, twice the level of engagement from people of color, from women, from disabled, from different categories of, diversity, LGBTQ community. You see just more representation there because they feel more comfortable. So you ask, how do you build that muscle? And also leaders can be there. So you have intentionality these days goes well beyond making statements, having a nice thing on your website, running surveys. It's really, people are looking for that next step. And we find that when leaders are willing to provide that level of psychological safety and transparency, that it really pays off in terms of results, which goes to the retention. We see easily 10, 20%, even sometimes we've seen 30% improvement in retention over just a few months. This is not a matter of years. People, as soon as you put an environment in place that says, hey, you can be anonymous here, you can tell, we really want to hear from you, all of a sudden there is just a step change. There is that moment of transformation where all of a sudden you see that people go, oh, well, these people are serious, and of course they test it at first. And that's where the leaders have to be authentic, and they have to be welcoming to all kinds of information they might get. But we've never had a negative outcome out of that. We've had sensitive conversations. We've had, people making inputs, but it's always been for the good of the company and the organization at the end.
Great insights, and I want to tie a couple of points from both what Jamie and you have said, Sonia, and bring it to Rhonda to look at the other side of the coin. And this is really quickly before we move on to the next section. I think when we're talking about employee engagement, the CEO of Ripple Analytics, Noah Pusey, brought this up in an earlier conversation where in the U.S., employee disengagement costs the U.S. economy somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 plus billion in lost productivity. That number might be low, but this is one of those things that I want to tie in. And then when you tie that to retention and turnover, and this is just, Jamie, when you mentioned retention and turnover, my ears went up because that's my nerd area there. But for every employee that leaves an organization, a typical organization can expect to run up to 200% of their annual salary and replacement costs. So if you're talking about, hey, what's the business impact of this? Those are a couple of them, but I want you to bring, Rhonda, I'd like you to bring really quickly the human side of that equation, which is employee burnout by not doing this. If you're not paying attention to these real impacts and talking about intentionality and vulnerability, what have you seen? How have you seen that show up in your workplace where employees are impacted in real ways? What's been your experience there?
Yeah, really great question. And I'm really loving this conversation because I feel like it is multifaceted and we're touching on a lot of different important areas, including the employee engagement. So the first thing I'm going to say is I think organizations should understand their employee types, right? There are different buckets of employees at your organization. They are not a monolithic group. So you've got your employees that are super high performers, ladder climbers. They want to rise. They're going to grind. They're on their hustle. You've got your employees who are going to show up and do their work, right? They're not doing any more, they're not doing any less, but they're doing a good job of what you hired them to do, right? Some of the quiet quitters fall into that category. Maybe they were before climbers. Now they're just like, you know what? I'm good. Just let me do my job. Employers need to understand that group and figure out if that's an okay group for them to have. And every organization can decide that for themselves. I would argue that it has to be, but we can have that debate later. Then you've got your group who are disengaged, right? You've got the employees who are coming in, they're barely doing what they need to do. They may be potentially performing. That's a different group, right? And you deal with that group in a different way. And then you have your group who were super high, have been sliding down, and now they're at the phase of burnout. Right? They're just exhausted. They're mentally, physically, and emotionally exhausted. So you have these different areas, these various ecosystems within your organization that you have to figure out how to deal with. And it's not one way, right? So leaders have to, this is where leadership and connection comes in. If you know your people, if you know what they care about, you know that there are some significant life changes and things happening for them, then you're able to dial into which group this employee falls in, and then subsequently what I need to do to manage that. So burnout is real. The employees that remain are overwhelmed, overloaded, and overtaxed, which continues to drive up that attrition. So it's sort of like a bit of this crazy chaos cycle that we get ourselves in. And someone has to be the one to break the cycle by starting to put in more intentional, inclusive, and psychologically safe cultures.
Great stuff, Rhonda. I want to transition a little bit. So we've talked throughout the conversation in terms of some of the ways that you can measure different outcomes from a psychological safety perspective and just setting the foundation in the organization for success. We've also talked about some of the behaviors that leaders need to model in order to create psychologically safe environments. So we've kind of organically kind of talked through that, but I want to tie a ribbon around the conversation and have each of you offer one key thing that would be your advice to leaders when it comes to either measurement or modeling from a behavior perspective, because that's important when we're looking at the mission of the show, which is to empower talent leaders to do more with less. So when we look at the issue of what are the things from a modeling and measurements perspective that leaders should be paying attention to and should be doing on a regular basis, what's your one critical item that you would recommend to leaders? Rhonda, I'll lead off with you. Then we'll have Sonia and Jamie chime in afterwards.
Yeah, so the one thing I would recommend is lower the emotional expense that is required by working for you. Okay, if I am emotionally exhausted and spent because I work for you, because my schedule's too tough, or because I don't have balance, because you text me all weekend, because you do all of these things, because you never ask about my family, because my daughter just got married and you didn't even mention it, right? That's an emotional expense, and I'm only going to be willing to pay it for so long. And so if I'm a leader, my job is to lower that emotional expense. And when you do that, I think it's sort of it sort of rises along with your engagement, right? So you lower the emotional expense of what it takes to work for you, and that allows the engagement to rise. And in that space, there's a psychological safety sort of that runs through the middle of that.
Great stuff, Rhonda. Jamie, same question to you. What's the one piece of or one action item from a modeling or measurement perspective that you would have for leaders?
One of the things that my team members often point out in me is this behavior around consistently asking for feedback and finding inclusive channels, asynchronous, synchronous live channels to receive that feedback, to the point where they're like, we already gave you feedback, Jamie, you want more? I'm like, yes. But here's how we find out the areas in which we may be biased. We ask this, hey, we're putting together a project plan. Is there anything here that may be disadvantaging a specific community, or that I may have missed as a leader here based on my own demographic backgrounds and my privileges? So actually engaging with the folks you get to work with often to receive feedback, being open to that feedback, I think just adds to what Rhonda is saying about making it easier to work with you as a leader. And it's not that hard, as long as you don't take things personally. I see feedback is just information. It's all about how I then ascribe my feelings towards it that make it either good or bad. And so creating that space for feedback, different channels, different ways to do it, I think is critical for a leader's success.
I really like what you said there, Jamie, because it's actually come up in a lot of different ways when I'm actually interacting with a team, because my default face is pretty angry looking or upset looking. So I lead off and say, hey, just because I'm rubbing my head or looking like I'm mad, that's my thinking face. That's not my angry face. So it's good saying that stuff out loud as a leader, that it creates that space, or at least that's how I took what you said.
Absolutely.
So if I'm wrong, we can talk about it later.
You're right. You're on path.
We all need a user's manual.
Yeah, but Jim, I would also give you kudos because you recognize that in yourself, right? That level of awareness is one that we could do like 4 more shows on awareness. So I'm going to be quiet now.
Yeah, we could do a whole bunch of shows on how Jim can look less angry in his interpersonal relationships too. But Sonia, I want your take on, when it comes to modeling and measurement, what's the one key thing that you would want leaders to model?
Yeah, look, I'll speak to measurements primarily because, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, right? We all know that. And I think the important thing about measurements is make it actionable. We have we have 50 KPIs, key performance indicators, that are focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and business and culture, so you can connect the dots, right? They span, representation, hiring, compensation, development, and performance, even your processes. We measure that to your benefits, your processes. We score everything. We have benchmarks. So we have lots of data, but it's easy to get a little bit, confused when you have too much data as well, right? So we always say we have 50, but just start with a handful, right? And we help, of course, select what those handfuls should be. And it's a journey. So this year we're measuring these things. Next year we might, add some things. But first and foremost, we talk about, is it actionable? Is it something that, as an organization, it's connected to what we said at the top of the show, right? When Rhonda mentioned about the why, is it connected to your business strategy and priorities, so that when you see this thing moving, you can also connect the dots and say, as a result, we're a better organization overall, not just for its own sake. So I think that connection with what you're measuring, having the connection back to the initial, what we talked about, the business objectives, and then something that you can actually take once, as you're measuring it, if it's going south, there's a lever, you can do something about it. Some things, there's just nothing you can do about. So we try and keep people away from that.
So it's, I think there's another element that I want to call out in what you said, Sonia, and that's the prioritization component of it, because regardless of where you are in your actual journey, there might be a laundry list of things that you want to fix. So you want to identify the most important and tackle those in sequence. So that's it. You kind of cheated by offering more than one in that. So I'm wagging my finger at you. So I want to keep it with you really quick. And when we look at this entire conversation about creating psychologically safe organizations and environments, what's the one key thing that you would urge leaders to keep in mind and take back to their organization to start on the path of being more psychologically safe as an organization?
I think everybody should recognize there's a new normal. The ways, and I think the point has been made. Jamie talked about all the things that are going on in the world. Keep in mind that we are all humans that are operating in this new environment. And so what's important is to educate yourself about new ways of creating that psychological safety. And we talked a little bit about digital. I know a lot of times we are uncomfortable. There are things we haven't tried in the past, but we must force ourselves as leaders to be, recognize that there's a new environment and therefore there's new solutions that are required. I find people shy away. I mean, the surveys are great. We always fall back on surveys, but it's just not enough to find out what your people are really thinking about and how, we always say culture is defined at the edges. So you have to see, the people that are underrepresented. Are you hearing the majority being happy doesn't mean you have, a fully inclusive organization. I mean, by definition, how are you capturing those on the, on the edges of this and their voices? How are they heard? Will they feel safe? And whatever you're comfortable with, but you have to educate yourself about there's new solutions and new ways of doing business that are coming out every day. And those that don't employ them or don't at least think about them, frankly, are going to see some consequences, I think, in terms of hiring and retention specifically.
You just dropped a great bumper sticker. Culture is defined at the edges. So I'm going to trademark that and profit off of it. So I don't want to hear anything from you. So great point, Sonia, as always. Jamie, I want to get your shot at creating another bumper sticker that I can turn into a monetization model. So what's your take?
The number one thing I would say is that it really starts with you. And that means that you got to get great as a leader in managing your own energy. If that means you need to go to therapy, get a coach, talk with a consultant, bring external help in, that's critical. I think about what an organization would be like if more people were taking care of themselves first. More leaders were taking care of themselves, were being vulnerable, were showing up fully authentic. That could be transformative for many places, not just for the people who work there, but for their customers and their business outcomes. And so I actually used to teach a course called Mental Health First Aid. Bring in mental health first aid into your community. Start to have conversations, start to destigmatize talking about psycho safety, mental health, all the things that we're talking about today, employee well-being. These things matter, and not just because they're nice or fluffy, but because they're going to make your business more successful. So it all starts from within.
Great stuff, Jamie. I'm going to actually draw an extreme example that I saw in my LinkedIn a couple days ago. And this was a story about how an employee was impacted by their leader who only took like 2 days off in an entire year, even though that they had unlimited PTO. So your behavior as a leader, speaking to just what you said, is going to impact everybody down the line from you. So you have to model what you accept and signal what's acceptable. So that's great, great input. Rhonda, I'm hesitating even giving you an opportunity to have a takeaway because you've had like 16 mic drop moments. So I'm not even sure we want to go this route, but I want to make sure that give you one more opportunity to add another mic drop moment. So what's your take?
All right. Well, so I'll start with this. I had an executive roundtable yesterday, and so I'll give credit to a gentleman, Jason, who attended our executive roundtable, where we were talking about leadership and talent development and the gap that exists. And Jason said, "You're not as good as you think you are, but you could be." Okay. You're not as good as you think you are, but you could be. So the idea is to figure out where you actually are. So elevating your awareness, both organizationally and as a leader, and then figuring out where you want to be, right? Because once you know where you are, you can figure out where you're going, right? And you can figure out what that looks like, and you can paint the vision and the picture to help you get there. So I like my one takeaway for leaders is figure out where you are, not where you think you are, but where your people feel like you are, and then decide where you want to go and how you want to get there.
Great stuff, Rhonda. And keeping it with you, I will make a note here. I expected this panel to be really, really good, and you're actually better than what I thought. So I'm going to be the contrarian to your point, Rhonda. But where can people find you?
Yeah, so for me, super easy. I'm super social, LinkedIn, Rhonda Y. Williams. You can reach me on all the social platforms at either Rhonda Y. Williams or Coach Rhonda Y. Williams. And you can also visit our website at atgleadership.com. You can find me all over the place at either of those. If you want to directly reach me, you can reach me at rwilliams@atgleadership.com.
Awesome stuff. Member number 2 of the Exceeding Expectations panel, Jamie, where can people find you?
You all can also find me via LinkedIn, as well as Twitter, Instagram, Jamie Adasi, everywhere. Additionally, if you want to learn more about Greenhouse software, you can go to greenhouse.com. You have a ton of information there, blog posts, etc. And the last thing I would say here, if you want to email me, I'm at jamie.adasi@greenhouse.io. Really excited to talk to more people.
Great stuff, and I appreciate your insights into this. Last but certainly not least, Sonia, again, the 3 of 3 of the exceeding expectations trio. So where can people find you?
Thank you, and you are exceeding everybody's expectations too, Dr. Jim. You can see my last name, it's Sepahban. You can reach me at Sonia with a Y, SONYA, at ouroffice.io. The name of our company is Our Office, no space. And you can, if you're interested in our solution, you can look at ouroffice.io. And you can get in touch with our D&I advisors who are standing by to talk to you, as they say.
Great stuff. I appreciate all 3 of you really advancing this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the feedback from those that are actually caught the stream and also seeing this on demand. I want to thank everybody for their time in advancing this conversation on the panel. I also want to thank everybody that joined the stream for their input and reaction. I think we made some real impact. The goal of the show is to help talent leaders do more with less by leveraging collective intelligence and community intelligence. I think we've done a good job here. For those of you who are interested in continuing the conversation, obviously reach out to any one of the panelists. If you have talent strategy challenges or questions, you can certainly reach out to me. I'm not very difficult to find, so you can follow me on any number of channels. So looking forward to next week, where we'll have another great conversation where we are looking to help you do more with less. Thanks for joining us, and tune in next time for another great episode of Talent Strategy 60.
Bye.